A narrative across the country is that many of the wildfires are simply burning out of control. The message that we're experiencing more fires than ever before and something more needs to be done. To talk about the wildfire situation in more detail is political commentator and Sun columnist Brian Lilley, who joins us once again from Toronto. Brian, the message that we're seeing more fires than ever before, does that match the provincial and federal data?
No, not really. In fact, wildfires were more numerous in the 1980s, the 1990s. They're bouncing back from the last few years. 2020, 2021, those were real low years. Right now, for example, in Alberta, it's about 634 wildfires so far this year. 2006, for example, there were, I think, 1,955 in a given year. So, the numbers vary wildly across the country. It's one of the reasons that you'll hear opposition critics or media critics say, oh, the government cut the firefighting budget. Well, it's because, they don't know how much it's going to cost to fight the wildfires each year. So just to give you the example of the province of Ontario, they set aside $100 million each year. That's the line item for the firefighters' budget for wildfires. And last year it was 238 million because there were a lot of fires. But previous years it was below 100 million because there weren't. And you don't want to be stuck with we're always going to spend the maximum amount that we have spent in the past if there's no fires. I mean, you hope to spend less. So there's a lot of false narratives out there. I'm not saying this is a good year for wildfires. Don't get me wrong, it's not. And they've happened in a way that has hit city people more than usual. City people in the prairies are used to smelling the smoke of wildfires. But I'll tell you, we're not used to experiencing it here in Toronto, where all last week I couldn't see Lake Ontario from the roof of my building where I normally can. Or in Ottawa, where my colleague Brian Pasfium, who used to work for the Pincher Creek Echo and the Calgary Sun and knows all about the orange sky that you get when the wildfires are bad. He was experiencing that in Ottawa. So, New York City, all of those things. It's hitting people that aren't used to doing it. And so I think it's getting more media attention. It's not a great year, as I said, but it's not the worst.
Yeah, the front page of the New York Post said, thanks a lot, Canada. A lot of the Ontario and Quebec wildfires making their way down to New York City. Now, Brian, Alberta Premier Danielle Smith is taking some heat for suggesting that she wants an investigation into whether a good portion of the wildfires in Alberta were deliberately set by arsonists. How much proof is there that a number of these fires were in fact deliberately set?
I don't know that there's proof yet or there'd be charges laid, but I can tell you straight across the country, whether it's in Ontario, Quebec, Alberta, various police forces are investigating certain fires for arson. It's interesting looking at the provincial data. In Alberta right now, for this year, as I said, as of this morning, I believe it was 634 wildfires. So far this year, only about 78, I think, are still active. Most have been extinguished. In Alberta, the majority are listed as human caused. And there's some great data sets from the provincial government that you can go through and look at and say, okay, well, when they say human caused, what do they mean? And it'll say campers cooking, fire got started. ATV, hot exhaust. If you're an ATV rider and it's really dry out, don't go out into the forest. That apparently starts a lot of fires, ATV, hot exhaust in very dry conditions. And you see all of these things listed down. So as I said, about 58% so far in Alberta are human caused, about 20% are lightning, and then the rest are unknown or undetermined at this time. In British Columbia, very different geography, very different settlement patterns. We're talking about 60% to 70% in any given year are caused by lightning. So it varies depending on where you live. And Premier Smith saying that, yeah, we should be investigating if some of these are caused by arson. Yeah, absolutely, because some of them are. Every single year, some of them are. But there is this narrative that we just have to blame all the wildfires on climate change. That would be irresponsible to do that. If there are people setting fires, you catch them, you charge them, you prosecute them. That's how it should be. So, people are getting upset at her, saying she's politicizing things when in fact, it's the other way around.
Did you also see that video that went viral on social media in Quebec with some of the fires that all started simultaneously at the same time? It was like a satellite imagery. And I said, here's yesterday and here's today. And then they all just kind of lit up at the same time. I don't know if you saw that video or how
No,
legit it
I
was.
haven't seen that, but I do know some of the fires north of Ottawa. There were several lightning strikes just north of Ottawa on June 1st, and that started several of the fires. There's so many ways that the fires can start. I hope it's not, some of the claims I've heard that there are groups out there trying to set the fires to push an ecological agenda. I hope that's not the case, although I have interviewed people who have advocated that sort of thing. There was a book out years ago called Deep Green Resistance, where I interviewed one of the authors, and they advocated doing all kinds of things inside and outside of the law in order to move their agenda along. Let's hope that's not the case, because it does put people's lives, their livelihoods, and much of our great forests at risk if you're acting in that way.
Absolutely, Brian. David Johnston stepped down as Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's special rapporteur late last week. Now, were you a little surprised by this announcement? And what comes next? Will we in fact see a public inquiry, which the opposition parties have been calling for?
I was actually surprised. 5:30 Ottawa time on a Friday afternoon, and suddenly David Johnston's resigned. I mean, he had been adamant that he wouldn't. In the face of a third vote in the House of Commons calling for a public inquiry and vote to have him removed as special rapporteur, he said no. He showed up at committee and was defiant in speaking with members of parliament. But he also showed that his report was based on incomplete intelligence. So there were a lot of negatives going on there, but he seemed adamant. The prime minister seemed adamant. And then suddenly he was gone. Now, Saturday morning, the prime minister, of course, was off in Ukraine, but Dominic LeBlanc, his intergovernmental affairs minister and fixer-in-chief, he held a news conference and he said, well, a public inquiry has never been off the table. Yeah, it has. After 3 different votes, the government said no. David Johnston's report said no. It's not like this is a new call for a public inquiry. I'm hoping that we're going to get one. As I've told you many times, I'm not a fan of public inquiries. I find them onerous, cumbersome, overly complex, and expensive. But I don't see any other option for getting to the bottom of China's election interference in this country, or its interference in terms of police stations, the Winnipeg lab, etc. We need to get to the bottom of this. And the Trudeau government has done everything from ignoring the will of the House of Commons to ignoring summons, to ignoring demands for documents, taking the House of Commons to court to shut down a demand for documents. I mean, these are unprecedented steps to keep things quiet. So I think we need a public inquiry. All 3 opposition leaders say they want one. They're going to work together to try and ensure that we get one, including finding someone to lead it who is truly independent, not tied to any of the parties.
So, Brian, if a public inquiry were to reveal, the information comes out that the Trudeau Liberals did not much to protect democracy, nor MPs, from being potentially threatened by China, by Beijing, would this maybe force Trudeau to resign?
It's difficult to say. I think he wants to continue on. I think he believes that he can convince his base that this is not an issue they need to be concerned about. And you already see that in polls. Whereas in early March, 71% of Liberals said, we need a public inquiry. The latest one was 59% said, oh, no, we don't. Everything's fine, of Liberal voters. And it's not like all of the rest said yes to a public inquiry. It was split between that and, I don't know. So, they just have to convince their own people that everything's okay, and then convince low information voters to back them over the big scary guy, Pierre Poilievre, which is going to be their play. That's their play. So my guess is that there's got to be something that they don't want out there. Every single political party will have trouble with this issue. Every single political party has been targeted by China. They're all going to have egg on their face if and when we get to a public inquiry. But 3 of the 4 have backed an inquiry and 1 hasn't. So is that because they did find out information and chose not to act? I'm increasingly coming into that belief, and that's why they fought this so hard and for so long.
Brian, as the Johnston saga was playing out, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau made a surprise visit to Ukraine to announce another $500 million in help in their war with Russia. Trudeau also gifted Ukraine a Russian plane, which had been sitting at Pearson Airport for more than a year.
Yeah, and for all the people that think he suddenly flew to Ukraine because David Johnston resigned, this is a trip that has been in the works for weeks now. This is something that you can't move a prime minister that quickly, especially into a war zone. So I think they probably delayed the timing of Johnston's resignation to work out so that it wasn't top of the news cycle for that long. But it's not like the PM left that quickly for that reason. Now, in terms of the plane, yeah, they gave this plane. It'd been, I think the fine was $5,000 a day for sitting at Pearson. And I don't think that the airport was ever going to get that money. And so they gave the plane to Ukraine. I hope that this signals that they might be willing to do something that supporters of Ukraine and sanctions against Russia have been calling on for some time, and that is to give Ukraine Putin's money. There's a lot of people don't like, and I'm fully supporting the government backing Ukraine in this fight, but there's a lot of people who are opposed to it. Well, here's an elegant solution, how. There are hundreds of millions, billions of dollars around the world, some of it here in Canada, held by central banks that has been frozen, seized by these foreign governments. We have legislation on the books that would allow us to hand that money over to Ukraine and say, hey, this $100 million, this was Vladimir Putin's money. Go fight him. I think that they should be doing that. For some reason, the Trudeau government, despite the legislation being on the book and despite advocates saying, hey, you should do this, they've been reluctant to do it. I say give them Putin's money, and this is cold hard cash. It's not, liquidating some oligarch's stake in a Regina steel mill, which still exists. It's giving them the cash that they had parked here in Canadian dollars or gold or other valuables and saying, help this fund your war effort against Putin's invasion.
So have the Trudeau Liberals explained why they're refusing to release that money?
No. I have tried to find out. People like Bill Browder, who's a strong advocate for fighting back against Putin's kleptocracy, he's tried and hasn't received solid answers yet. The government, I believe, keeps saying we're looking into it, but they haven't acted yet. So I'd encourage them to consider that at this point as a way to aid Ukraine in this fight.
Brian, the Trudeau government is promising a review, and the Poilievre Conservatives are promising legislation in the face of public outrage that Paul Bernardo's transfer from a maximum to a medium security prison. Will there be any changes, or do you think this is just political theater?
There's a lot of political theater anytime Paul Bernardo's name ends up in the news and politicians are asked to comment. And we saw that with everyone reacting, including the government of the day and Public Safety Minister Marco Mendicino saying, oh, well, we didn't know this was happening. There's far too many things that minister and this government don't know is going on within their own administration. That's problematic. We heard the calls for Paul Bernardo to rot in a jail cell, or my personal favorite, it was Paul Bernardo should rot in hell, and until that day comes, he should rot in a jail cell. I think that is for those of us who lived through that time frame and remember it, that is the sentiment of an awful lot of people. But I'm not sure that there is the appetite to go in and say, you know what, for certain prisoners, we need to make sure that they're looked after in a certain way. There's long been a hands-off approach when it comes to justice, but I don't understand how you can say that the family shouldn't have been notified ahead of time, and instead they're finding out as it's happening or in the media, and they're traumatized all over again. And if this is an event that brings up horrible memories for me, and I wasn't involved, I just lived near it and through it. Imagine being the families, and there's more than just the French and Mahaffey families. Paul Bernardo was a serial rapist. On top of all of this, there are so many women who this man traumatized with his vile and violent acts, and we need to do better on this.
Brian, you and I are always keeping an eye on the polls. Well, now a new poll by Lethbridge said the Trudeau Liberals were in the lead in popularity, but an analyst poll says there are a number of Liberal seats which are up for grabs. So what's your take on all of this?
I don't think either poll is necessarily inaccurate. They're taking different snapshots in time. And what I always try and tell people is remember, when you see national poll numbers, that means very little. Trudeau Liberals being ahead by 2 points doesn't mean they're going to win seats in Alberta. Oh, I mean, maybe they'll keep the ones they have, but they're not going to be sweeping Alberta. When you look at the Leger poll, that was an awful lot of support in Atlantic Canada, 50% support. When you look in Ontario, that same Leger poll said the Conservatives were ahead by a few points. Okay, well, how does that translate to Nanos? Well, Nano shows, as does Leger, that the Liberals are down in Ontario and Quebec and in BC. These are the battleground areas. The Liberals are going to sweep Atlantic Canada. The Conservatives are going to sweep most of the prairies. So it comes down to the battlegrounds in the Lower Mainland, in and around Toronto, and in certain regions of Quebec. And in Quebec, it's between the Bloc and the Liberals. So yeah, these Liberal seats are up for grabs. They're in play in ways that they haven't been the last few elections, and that should be worrying for the government. So national poll numbers, they're going to say a certain amount, but you need to get down into the regionals. And when you look at both Leger and Nanos, they're telling you the same things. The government currently is vulnerable. They could still squeak it out. I never count out Justin Trudeau and the Liberals, but some seats that they might have considered safe in the past are now in play.
Political reporter and Sun columnist Brian Lilley, thanks so much for joining us today from the Big Smoke.
Thank you, Hal.